Hello friends, good morning. The new academic year has begun. This is our first session on English literature and language. Today we have a talk on an introduction to English literature and literary studies. Today we have in our studio two very eminent professors and authors. One is Dr. Deeptha Achar. She is an associate professor with the Department of English, MS University, Baroda. She is an experienced teacher, has taught to several classes and has earned a noun as and fame as a very talented teacher. She has authored several books. She is in charge of the UGC Departmental Research Scheme of the Department of English, MS University, Baroda. We have another eminent fellow with us, Dr. Sachin Katka. He is also an associate professor in the Department of English, MS University, Baroda. He is himself a practicing poet. It is indeed a very great pleasure for all of us to have him with us. He writes poetry. He is a good translator and a practicing critic also. His latest collection of poetry is called Jara Sandacha Blog Varche Kahi Ansh. He writes in Marathi and in English. He has been teaching English literature to students for many years. This is a special initiative of the government of Gujarat Higher Education, in which teachers from all over Gujarat, eminent teachers, are invited to give talks on various topics. This is the beginning of this year's BISEC session on English literature. And now I invite both the eminent scholars to give their very scholarly views about what is literature, why do we study literature, what are the things that a student while studying literature should keep in mind. So now I hand over the session to my friends, Dr. Katka and Dr. Achar.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello friends. So we will have a very informal kind of talk regarding very basic aspects of literature, regarding the thoughts that usually occur to students when they enter the first year. What is literature? Why do we study it? What do we mean by literary studies? And things like, what is literary criticism? So what I will do with Deeptha here, that we'll have a conversation about very basic elements of literary studies. And so we will start with the very definition of the term literature, and I will ask Deeptha here to respond to what is, in her view, meant by literature. So let's begin by looking at the slides, and then followed up by discussion on the basic aspects of literary studies. So the first thing that comes to our mind is, what is literature? And then we can think of why we study it in the first place.
So if you can look at the cartoon, you can see that literature is just a long text message. So today when we think of literature, we're really thinking of a text which is written down and which has a particular shape, a form, belonging to a particular genre.
That's very interesting. Let us think about how we use the term literature in our day-to-day life. And when we use the word literature, we basically use it in two ways. First, we use it with a definite article, and other way of using the word literature is without the use of definite article.
Does it make so much of a difference?
It does. It definitely does. At least for the students who want to find out what do we mean when we study literature. What is it that they are studying? If somebody asks them, what are you studying? Then they have to answer. I think should they use literature with definite article, or should they use it without definite article? Let's look at the next slide. when we use word literature with the definite article as I want to read all the literature on malaria, it means I want to read everything printed available to me on the subject of malaria. And when I want to use word literature without the definite article, what do we mean? When we use it without the definite article, as in I have selected literature as one of my subjects in college, it implies texts which have significant artistic value in a particular culture. Now, do you think the text that you find in your mobile has significant artistic value, Deepta?
Well, the day we have mobile novels, then it might have significant literary value. But as of now, we just use it to pass on common information and sometimes jokes and other common things. So as of now, I would not say that literature without the definite article is found in mobiles.
Right. But the distinction between literature with definite article and without definite article is a very important distinction for a student who just starts to study literature in college. The question then arises, if literature without the use of article is what we are going to study, then why do we study it in the first place?
Yeah. Actually, this is a question that has been answered in different ways all across time. When we first look at the study of literature, it was basically done outside college. But when the study of literature entered colleges, then there were different reasons. One of the important reasons was to expand education to groups of people who had not acquired knowledge. The second reason was to give information about a nation and a nation's culture. And later on, some people believed that we study literature in order to understand life itself. But today, I think there is a general consensus that we have a specific reason to study literature, and that is, if you look at the slide, because it is an extremely important part of our culture and society. It helps us to understand human beings, the society and arts in a better way. So basically, to study literature is to study ourselves and our own culture.
Very often I have found, Deepta, that when students are asked, what are you studying? Or why are you studying the things that you are studying? Then they are at loss of words. They don't know what to reply. So I think now it should be clear that we study literature because it's such an important part of our culture and society, and it helps us to explain and understand our own life and society around us.
Not only that, we also have to understand that you cannot separate literature from society. So if we need to know more about our society, we need to study our literature as well.
Right.
Can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, definitely. Let us look at how the word literature is used here. When we talk of Gujarati literature, if I am studying Gujarati literature, I am studying things like poems of Jhaverchand Meghani or novels of Pannalal Patel.
And so why is it that things like a Gujarati newspaper is not focused on in Gujarati literature?
That, I think, ties up with what we were discussing earlier, with what is distinction between literature with the and without the definite article the. So when we are reading poems by Meghani, we are studying literature without the use of definite article. Yeah. But the question that again would come to our mind would be, when we say Gujarati literature, what does the word Gujarati mean?
Do you think it has just one meaning, the word Gujarati? In fact, it has several meanings. It can be a language, such as the Gujarati language. It can also indicate a region, which is the region of Gujarat, the state of Gujarat. And finally, it can mean a community, a people, such as the Gujarati people. So whether a Gujarati person is in Gujarat or in the USA, you can still be Gujarati.
Right. So I think we can. This will lead us further to what do we understand by English when we think of English. We are students of English literature. What do we understand by the word English?
So in the same way, you can see that English can mean a language, such as the English language. It can also indicate a region, that is the region of England, from where you get the word English in the first place. And finally, it can mean a community or a nationality, such as the English. For example, when we use the word, the English ruled over India for several years. So English can have several meanings, just in the same way that Gujarati has several meanings.
Right.
I was also thinking, Sachin, that we need to think about what happens when we tie the word English with the idea of literature. What does it mean when we say English literature?
So let's look at the next slide here. It can also mean many things. It can mean literature in the English language. Just like when we think of Gujarati literature, we say literature in Gujarati language. So similarly, when we talk of English literature, it implies literature in the English language.
So it doesn't have to be people from England who write, but
Exactly.
it can be people like R.K. Narayan, our own R.K. Narayan, who has written Malgudi Days, Guide, and so many other books, as well as the poems of the American poet Robert Frost, whose poem was deeply loved by Nehru, stopping by woods on a snowy evening. So there is a sense in which everything that is written in English, everything literary that is written in English is literature in the English language.
So you can also include poets from other nationalities, like from Australia, New Zealand, writers from Africa, writers from South Africa, from Sri Lanka, who write basically in English language. We study them when we study English literature. Now let's look at the other meaning of the word literature here. It also means literature from England.
We tend to use the term English literature for all literature from England. That is, plays of Shakespeare, novels of Thomas Hardy or Charles Dickens, short stories by various writers, and essays by R.L. Stevenson, things that you have been reading right from school onwards.
Right. So if you look at the term English literature, then we should keep it in mind that it means many things, not just one thing. So if somebody asks you, the students tomorrow, that what do you study when you study English literature, then you should be able to reply that there are many literatures that we are actually studying. And the term English literature has got many connotations and shades of meaning. Let's look at the next shade of meaning here. It means literature of the English people.
Literature of the English people also indicates literature by people of the English nationality. They may come from Ireland, Wales, or Scotland. Now this is something surprising, isn't it? We always think of England as, or Great Britain as it is called today, as something which is of belonging, which does not have many shades or many nationalities. But the truth is, England contains people of several different nationalities, such as Irish, Welsh, and Scottish. The writings of people from these areas which carry strong traces of their own region has influenced English literature in very profound ways. In the same way, we can say Gujarati literature has profoundly influenced the making of an Indian literature. So we can see how English literature contains the writings of people from different regions within England.
Deepta, sometimes question comes to my mind, if people from England having same nationality as English, then what about their languages? What about Scottish language? What about Welsh? What about Irish? These are the languages, probably they also have their literature. Now can you call them English literature?
This is somewhat problematic. If we consider English literature to be literature in the English language, then perhaps we cannot call it English literature. But if we consider English literature to be that literature which comes from the territory of England, then perhaps we must allow it in. But there is no final answer to this question.
It's very interesting. Now let's look at another way in which we think of English literature. And the other way we can think of things more complicated for us and our lives as students of English literature and as teachers of English literature. Let's look at the next problem on our hand. We are thinking of literature in English language, which is translated from other languages. We also study literature from other languages like Gujarati, from Tamil. We can also think of languages like French and German translated into English. And we often study such texts in our during our MA and BA courses.
One of the texts which is commonly prescribed for English literature courses is The Doll's House, and it was not written in English, it was only translated into English. Similarly, when we read the Gitanjali in our English language classrooms, we are reading a text which was originally written in Bengali. The idea of studying English translation in our English literature courses is a new one. It is something which has come into our courses only in the last 15 or 20 years. Earlier, we would not be studying translations of Indian writings into English. But one good thing, as a result of this, we get to study our own culture more closely through these translations. We no longer study a foreign language or a foreign literature as if it is something far away from us. Now, literature can bring our own culture closer to us.
And interestingly, English language has a role to play in bringing our own literature closer to us. Think about Tamil literature, which is accessible to a Gujarati person or a Bengali person. So the term English literature is extremely complicated, having shades and variety of meanings, ranging from indications of nationality, indicating a language that is English. It indicates also the region called England, but it also indicates literature which is translated from other languages to English language. So what we have is a very complex and varied body of text which go under the name of English literature. And I feel that this diversity is something that is to be celebrated. And
don't you think that it is in some way very like India itself?
Exactly.
A wide variety of people, languages, cultures, but all housed under one nation. In the same way, we have a varied body of texts all housed under the title English literature.
So we have reached a point where we are able to distinguish between the two ways of using the term literature, and we have also reached a point where we can talk about the term English literature and various connotations of the term English literature. Now, as we proceed further in our study of English literature, the first thing that comes to our mind is the idea of genre. And interestingly, when a student is asked, what are you studying? Then usually students reply in terms of genres. We are studying poems or novels or plays. That's what we do usually. But these things, the technical term for this is genre. So let's look at the term genre closely. The next slide would be, what is genre?
The word genre comes from the French, but before that, Latin word for kind or class. The term is widely used to refer to a distinctive type of text. Next.
When we think of types of texts in literature, some of the broad classification of the various literary texts would be as follows. Now let's have a look at the next slide. In literature, the main genres are poetry, prose and drama.
Within drama, there are further divisions such as tragedy and comedy within the category of drama, and in prose you also have the distinction between short story, novel and essay. In poetry, the broad classification between epic poetry and lyric poetry. So you can see that each of these three broad genres are subdivided and further divided into smaller and smaller category. And as you study more and more literature, you will find out more and more about smaller and smaller categories within these genres.
Deepta, it's also interesting to keep in mind that the use of word literature with the definite article also has its own classification. For example, you can think in terms of genres of various variety of writings which is not classified as literature. For example, things like a letter can also be thought of as a genre.
Or sports writing,
Right.
travel writing, diary writing. But sometimes today the overlap between these forms of writing and the writing that you find in literature without the definite article is blurring. The distinctions are falling apart, and now a well-written travelogue can also be a part of English literature.
So this blurring of genres is probably what Shakespeare had in mind when he was making fun of all various genres of drama. So let's have a look at what Shakespeare had to say with tongue in his cheek about the whole idea, whole business of genre.
Yeah.
Shakespeare refers sarcastically to the classification of genres in his very famous play Hamlet. He talks of tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral, pastoral comical, historical pastoral, tragical historical, tragical comical historical pastoral.
I think, Sachin, what Shakespeare was trying to point out was that more important than a division or subdivision, what is more important is what a text is trying to do, what it is trying to say, and how it is put together as a literary text.
Right. So genre is the term that all students of literature should keep in mind, and this is what you will be studying usually when you reply to someone that I'm studying literature. You imply literary genres very often. So you can also think of one of the definitions of the term literature would be, in a very common way of saying in layman's language, would be the study of genres which are classified as literary. The other term which is also very important to us is the term called literary studies. So the question that comes to our mind is, why do we need to study literature? Because it's an important part, important component of our culture and society. Then how should we study it, and in what way will we study it? Now these are the questions which scholars and critics have addressed for a long period of time. So let's have a look at the term literary studies.
Literary studies is an all-inclusive term for the systematic study of literary texts. It adds to our knowledge of literature. It includes literary theory, literary criticism, and literary history.
Very important word here would be the word systematic. And that is the reason why it adds to the body of knowledge about literature. Now that we know why we need to study literature, we should also think of how to study literature, and literary studies is a term that is used for a systematic inquiry, a study of literary texts. And
I think we should pay attention. If we go back to the slide, we can see that there are three aspects to the study of literature. One, it is literary theory. Number two, literary criticism. And three, literary history. It is when, so the systematic study of literature can be either or all of these three aspects.
Yeah. So let us look in greater detail at the terms like literary theory, literary criticism, and literary history. The next slide here talks about what do we understand by the term literary criticism.
Literary criticism is a reasoned and systematic discussion of literature. It usually does not have the negative meaning we usually associate with the word criticism. This means that it does not mean to say that this kind of text is bad or that is not well written, but rather literary criticism studies systematically and deeply what is literature. So in a way, when you study English literature, you are learning to become a critic of English literature. You are not learning to write English literature, but you are learning to do literary criticism.
An analogy which I often give to my students is when you watch a film and report to your friends about how it was, you might first just say, I liked the film, or I didn't like the film, I didn't like this. But once you start giving reasons to that, once you start explaining things, once you start using a systematic kind of language to discuss what you experienced.
Say that the dialogue was unnatural, or the actor didn't act well, the songs were rubbish, it is then that you start becoming a critic.
Exactly. So criticism involves, that's the meaning of the term reason that we used earlier. It involves reasoning and it should be systematic. These are the expectations from a critical discourse. Another analogy which I use for my student is that criticism is also a form of language that you use to talk about literature. It's the way of speaking about literary text or works of art. So in itself, it's a form of language.
By this, I think, Sachin, perhaps you mean that literary criticism has its own technical terms.
Exactly.
Technical terms with which the discussion of literature takes place is the language of literary criticism. So, it is important as students of literature to have familiarity with technical terms of literary criticism. So, when you discuss a novel, you should know what the difference is between a story and a plot. You should know what an atmosphere is or what a setting is. So, it is these things, it is the knowledge of these aspects which allow you to become a better literary critic.
Now let us look at various types of criticism. There are many theoretical approaches to literary criticism, but that there are two broad categories of literary criticism. So let's look at the two main types of criticism here. Let's look at the next slide.
We usually contrast theory with practice, that is, thinking about something to actually doing something. Hence, we can think of two types of criticism. theoretical criticism, which is thinking about literature, and practical criticism, which is about the analysis of literature.
So let's look at the terms theoretical criticism and practical criticism a little bit more closely, because as students of literature we are expected to understand the distinction between two, though the distinction is not very natural or normal at particular point. It breaks down just because relationship between theory or reflection and acting or practice is always a complicated one, but it's a very useful distinction to make. So let's look at the next slide, which looks at both the terms a little bit more closely. The theoretical criticism, or what is understood as literary theory.
More generalized, abstract and conceptual discussion of literature, like the definition of literariness, classification of various types of literature, relation of literature and society, literary values and so on, is called literary theory.
So what is implied by theory here is that it's very general and at the same time it's very abstract. So one of the reasons why students find it difficult to grapple with criticism and theoretical criticism is because it's very abstract, very general and very, very conceptual.
But it is also very important to learn a little bit of literary theory. That is because if we only studied individual texts, we would never understand the relationship between texts. So we would never understand the relationship between literature and our culture. We would not understand the relation between literature and history. So literary theory allows us to see connections between texts, between literature and society, literature and history. So I'm afraid, hard as it might be, we should not and cannot get away from it.
What it implies probably is that we are looking at the bigger picture, not just the specific text. So how is the particular text that you are looking is related to the bigger picture and the bigger questions like what is literature, or what is function of literature, how does it relate to society, what is meaning of the term literature for society and its history. So these are very big issues that theory usually raises, and these are extremely crucial for enhanced understanding of literary texts. And so it's very interesting when you contrast it with practical criticism. So let's have a look at the term practical
criticism. Just some information for you. Examples of literary theory. You can see that literary theory is very, very old and it took place in all parts of the world. You have Aristotle Poetics, written in 335 BCE in Greek, and Bharata's Natya Shastra of India, which is written perhaps in 200 BCE. Around there, nobody exactly knows where it was written, and these are some of the earliest examples of theoretical criticism.
Shall we have a look at more recent examples of literary theory?
Yes, especially because literary theory has been an important branch of thought right from Aristotle's time right up to ours. Rennie Welleck and Austin Warren's Theory of Literature and Jonathan Culler's Literary Theory, a very short introduction, are recent examples of theoretical criticism. And the picture you see is of Jonathan Culler.
Other very pertinent examples of recent theoretical studies of literature would include Catherine Bell's Critical Practice, and slightly dated but equally interesting Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism in probably 1949, probably the same year as Rennie Welleck and Austin Warren's book was published.
These are texts that you might be studying either in the third year of BA or perhaps in MA. But it is useful, however, to know that such texts exist and to recognize that it is not enough to read a poem, but you must also understand what that poem means and how to discuss that poem.
Exactly. So again we come to the idea of literature as a form of language which we use to discuss something which is already linguistic, like work of art which is called literature. So some people use the term meta language to describe criticism.
Yeah. Meta means over. Language, all of you know. So meta language means it is a language about language. So literary criticism can be, or literary theory can be thought of as a language about language.
So interestingly, while theoretical criticism looks at literary texts in a very broad perspective, which are historical, social, cultural, philosophical, practical criticism looks at the individual and particular aspects of the text. So let's have a closer look at what do we understand by the term practical criticism. Let's look at the next slide.
The image you see on your screen is one of the most important works of practical criticism, and I.A. Richards is the critic who is very closely associated with this method of criticism. Practical criticism involves analysis, interpretation, and evaluation of particular literary texts rather than discussion of literature in general.
I think that is a very important term, in general, because in theoretical criticism we are looking at literary texts from a very broad perspective. In practical criticism we are attending to very specific and particular qualities and elements of the text that we are confronted with. For example, when you are analyzing a poem or a novel, you are dissecting it, you are interpreting it, you are explaining it. At the same time, you are evaluating it. You are practicing what is known as practical criticism.
The study of specific texts is very important to the subject of English literature. Most of what we do in our undergraduate courses focuses on the study of particular texts. So much of what students of undergraduate classes do is practical criticism. What is done in our classrooms is practical criticism. But when we study a poem or a play or a novel, we find that just looking at the words on the page is not sufficient. We also need to understand the context, that is, when the poem was written and how it was written.
Right. And also why it was written probably. When we are trying to place it in a very broader cultural context, we are trying to understand the text in a very broader context when we are using what is the theoretical approach to
give
criticism.
An example, one of the texts that we study is Shakespeare's Macbeth. I'm sure some of you would have seen the film Macbeth, and Macbeth is supposed to be based on Shakespeare's Macbeth. Now, why did Shakespeare write Macbeth when he did? After all, it's about, what is Macbeth about? It's about a king. It's about the murder of a king. And it is about what happens when you try to become a king by wrongful means. Now, the reason why kingship was so important in Shakespeare's time was because monarchy was the burning issue of that time. Similarly, when we look at Pannalal Patel's Bhavni Bhavai, you find that he writes about hunger, right?
Yeah.
He writes about hunger and the plight of common people, because that is the burning issue of his time. So you cannot understand the text only by reading the text. We all need to understand history a little bit in order to understand the meanings of that text.
I fully agree with you, Deepta. And at the same time, let me point out that practical criticism is, as Deepta said, very closely tied up with classroom practice, and that's why earliest examples of practical criticism were tied to the idea of classroom teaching, or what is called pedagogy. If you look at the examples of practical criticism in the next slide, you will see that some of them are purely for classroom purposes, like Understanding Poetry by Cleant Brooks and Robert Penn Warren is an excellent example where the critics show how to analyze, discuss, evaluate those poems or the texts.
Particularly for the
Classroom.
And though it was published in 1938, it still continues to be in wide use even till today. This shows that practical criticism is an essential part of English literature in India today as well.
Right. So, till now we have seen some of the very basic and fundamental ideas that a student of literature ought to know, and those ideas, let me recapitulate very quickly. The first is the distinction between the two ways of using the term literature, which helped us to define something like literature. The definitions are of course very difficult, but for our purpose, a working definition of literature is what we arrived at when we said that literature without the use of definite article, which indicates text having significant cultural value, artistic value, are called can be classified as literature. The second thing that we thought about was the term English literature, and we saw that it's not a simple term at all, and it has got a whole variety of meanings, and the whole term English literature includes various kinds of texts, the texts from England, those texts written in English, those texts written by people who come from England, and the literary texts which are translated from other languages into English language. Then we went over to the whole idea of literary studies, wherein we looked at the three aspects of literary studies. One is theoretical literary theory, the other was literary criticism, and the third, the very important category, is that of literary history, and that is what we are going to look at a bit closely now. Now let's look at the term literary history. So we'll look at it in our next slide. What is literary history?
Literary history implies history of a particular literature, that is, history of Gujarati literature or history of English literature. It is concerned with changes in literary norms, periodization, dominant trends, important authors, texts of various periods and tradition.
So when we study literature and when we study English literature, as we move ahead, then we are confronted with various periods and eras in which literature was produced, and we read those literary texts as representing those periods and eras. So some of very common periods in English literature are as follows. So we'll just put it up for you. You can take them down if you want. Let's have a look at the common periods of English literature.
Slow down. Shakespeare, for example, wrote in the Elizabethan age. The Commonwealth period was the period where Milton flourished. So you can see each of these ages, Renaissance, Elizabethan, Jacobean, Caroline and Commonwealth, had their own important writers and different genres For example, in the Elizabethan period, drama was more popular. In the Commonwealth period, drama was banned and the focus was on prose and on poetry. In the next century, you have the Restoration period, which comes towards the end of the 17th century, the Neoclassical period, the Augustan age, where important writers like Swift and Pope wrote, the age of sensibility, where people started focusing on emotion, and the Romantic period with the famous Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats and Shelley, with the special focus on poetry. And finally, we have the Victorian period of the 19th century, the Edwardian period of the early 20th century, the Georgian period, and finally from 1914, the beginning of the First World War, we have the modern period, a period which has decisively changed literature in a way that has affected drama, poetry and prose in a way which has never been seen before. And today we have postmodernism as well.
So you can see that a student of literature has to know what is literary history. Student of literature is supposed to know the definitions of the term literature. The student of English literature ought to know what is English literature, and these are the things that we looked at in a very basic and simple way. Another very important idea that is related to the idea of literary history is the idea of canon. What do you think, Dipta, about the term canon? Is it the same canon that you find on the forts?
Not actually. Canon really is a very simple thing. It just means a list. It's just a list of books. But it's a very special kind of list, like a merit list. When colleges open and you're anxiously looking at your name, is my name on the merit list? In the same way, canon is just a list of very special literary books which is to be found in English literature. Sachin, I was wondering if we had any questions from students who have been listening to us so far, and if we can take some questions if there are any.
Yeah, if students have questions, they can call us here. The numbers are given to the colleges. This was a very fruitful session. Both the eminent faculties have discussed the very basic concept, what is literature, the very basic question that every student faces when he enters colleges as a student of literature. And I am very glad that both of them have clarified the issues minutely, in detail, giving very interesting examples and making things lucid for the students. And I hope all of them must have enjoyed. Dr. Sachin, we often hear about literature of power and literature of knowledge. That is how we usually divide literature. So can we say something about that to our students?
Interestingly, the distinction between literature of power and literature of knowledge was made by De Quincey in 19th century, and probably what he was trying to do is to have his own list of his authors in the merit list.
His own
An attempt at
Canon.
canonization. But in a general way, we can say that the literature that gives information, that is what he wanted to suggest, that literature that gives information, that is the word literature used in a very general sense. For instance, a telephone directory, and we say I have all the literature about, say, inflation, and there we use the word literature in a very general way. Telephone directory or railway timetable, that is the literature. And when we say literature, that means literature of power, that is creative literature.
Right.
That is what probably the distinction suggested. And as you rightly said, De Quincey was attempting a sort of canonization. He was giving, he was making a list of his own writers who have merit. So that is how I think literature can be best understood. Our students will now come in close contact with works of literature. They will read them. They will form their own opinion, and that is when I think the literary study begins. The student starts forming their own opinion about a poem. When he says that I like this poem, then the critic in him begins to react and starts analyzing, appreciating, evaluating the text that he has with him. We have some textbooks. Shall we show them to
these
our
are
students?
very useful books for literary studies for beginners. The first is Glossary of Literary Terms by M.H. Abrams. Then you can have the book called Literary Theory, a very short introduction by Jonathan Culler, which
and this is basically for slightly more advanced students.
Right.
But Glossary of Literary Terms can be, you should try and refer to it as much as possible right from the first year of BA onwards. It's used like a dictionary, and you can learn about different types of genres, different periods of history, different kinds of criticism if you look up a glossary of literary terms. So please go to your college libraries and look up a glossary of literary terms. M.H. Abrams is one good glossary, but you can also look up the Penguin Glossary of Literary Terms, and there are many others also. But please try and look up these books, because this will be just as a dictionary is, the Glossary of Literary Terms is your companion through your English literature course.
May I add, Deepta, the internet as one of the sources and resource material for a student of literature, and there are many online glossaries too, which you must just have to Google the word English literature, and you will have a list of very useful websites which will help you in the course of study.
Thank you, Dr. Katka, Dr. Acha.
Pandya, could we just have one last slide?
That slide could be shown. It is very interesting for students. The time does not permit us, but otherwise this is a very interesting topic.
I think we'll leave students with this.
We will leave students with this slide.
Yeah. Hope you enjoy your study of literature, and hope you enjoyed this session
also.
also.
And we wish you all the best for your future.
Hope you become real students of English literature. You enjoy your study, not as an academician, but in real sense you enjoy the literature that you study, and then you will become a real student of literature. Thank you all.
Thank you.
It was a very studied talk, and thank you on behalf of all the students who listened to you.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you very much.